Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We are continuing with the letter E for equip. And I'm going to pick up really where I left off last week as we're talking about the need to develop others and what is it that holds us back. We looked at really just, there's a fear of, I can do it better, so it's not going to be done as well. And then part of sometimes what drives that fear, really even deeper than that, is this sense of, man, my identity is wrapped up in the things that I do. And so we're going to kind of build on that same thought. The thing that often keeps us from investing in to others is that I continue to find a sense of value in being needed. And in fact, there are certain people I have seen over the years that they'll let other people fail on their team to be able to kind of go, see, you needed me. See, yeah, you didn't listen to me. Or, hey, and they actually are really toxic in their leadership because, they see somebody fumble and they kind of just let the ball bounce down the field because it's more about them than it is the team win. It's more about them and their need to feel valued. And so I just kind of want to unpack this a little bit, because when a person feels their identity and their value is in being needed versus being useful, then I think there's a toxicity that can get inside of that. And I've just seen this over the years really trip up certain leaders. And if they don't deal with it, they don't last here. I know that. And really, they don't last anywhere, because ultimately people don't like toxicity. So Leviticus chapter 10, Aaron's sons offer what's called strange fire before the Lord. So they grab their censers and they get fire from a fire other than the fire that's supposed to be from the altar of the Lord. Then we see that, God consumes them with fire. And so here's just kind of a spiritual picture, because remember, all these Old Testament stories are actually pictures of New Testament principles. And it's this: when we feel burned up, burned out, or burned by ministry, it could be that we're getting the fire of motivation from an altar other than the Lord's. And so when there's anything that's truly motivating us to do what we do outside of the altar of Christ and simply gratitude for Jesus, his sacrifice for us, we've been bought by the blood of the Lamb, and we're just grateful. If there's something motivating us other than the fire of the altar of God, then ultimately down the road, we're going to get burned up. We're going to get burned out, and we're going to feel burned by ministry. And so that's important. Just what's motivating you? Where's your passion coming from? Again, is it, I need to feel needed. I need to feel useful. I need to be noticed. Hey, look at me. I can do it better than anybody else. Long term, you're just on a course for burnout. Moses had a vision, and that was to see his people get free. And so he shows up on the scene. He sees a fellow Hebrew being beaten by, an Egyptian taskmaster. And so he kills him. He shows up on the scene, and basically here's what he says. He goes, "Here am I. I'm the deliverer." And he had the right heart in terms of what his mission was, but he definitely had the wrong perspective in how to get there. So he flees. He's in the backside of a desert for 40 years, and then God's humbling him. God's purging him. God's working in him. He went from being the man with the plan, the man that can, to who am I? So in Exodus 3:11, he sees the burning bush. He turns aside. He encounters with God, and God says, "I want to use you." And I just love his response, Ephesians 3:11. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Wow, that's a pretty big change from 40 years. 40 years ago, young Moses, hey, here I am. Now it's like, who am I? And sometimes God allows us to get from here I am to who am I? And you really kind of get to determine how long that desert is. There's a lot of people who spend their whole life in that desert, die in the desert, and never reach the point where they realize it's not if it's to be, it's up to me. It really comes down to it's about Jesus. It's not about me. It's about God, the I am. And so often God allows us to get there. We see this in the life of Saul. In fact, Saul in Acts chapter 13, Saul literally means requested one. And then we see down the road, not far after Acts 13, that he changes his name to Paul. So he's changing his name from the Hebrew name to a Roman name, which allows him to kind of integrate and mingle within the Roman community. But what's really more important is Paul means little. And what we see is this journey of Paul moving from, hey, I'm the requested man, I'm the man with the plan, you all need me, to, hey, I'm just little, I'm a nobody. We see him even in his journey. As you read the kind of the layout of the epistles, we see him, in 1 Corinthians 15:9. I'm the least of the apostles. Okay, but he puts himself there. And then down the road we see him in Ephesians 3. I'm the least of the saints. All right, he went from apostle down to I'm the least of the saints. And then we get to the end, and he's in 1 Timothy 1:15, and he goes, okay, I figured it out. I'm just the chief of sinners. And I love that little digression, because a lot of times we think maturity is this, whole self-esteem thing that really it's Christ esteem. It's that it's not about us getting bigger in our eyes. It's about us getting lower in our eyes and God getting bigger in our eyes. And that's where God wants to take us. And so if we don't get this right, the motivation right, it's not about me. It's about Jesus, the great I am. I'm not I am. It's a liberating day when we go, I'm not Christ. John the Baptist's words to those searching for the Messiah, he goes, I'm not the Christ. That is so liberating. And so that's just one more thing that kind of holds people up from delegating. So these are just kind of heart checks. If you're struggling with equipping, you look at your last year, you haven't equipped anybody. Nobody's asking you to equip them. There might be these little heart issues that God just wants to tweak inside of you. And we're going to continue on with Equip. Got some very practical things we're going to get into about equipping people.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.